From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. We're going to start our program today with a check on stocks, which are up again, maybe on news that Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, has withdrawn from the race for president, leaving Joe Biden, the former vice president, the presumptive Democratic nominee. But for the full report on the stocks, let's turn now to Taylor Riggs. Taylor?
I wanted to take a look now at the S&P 500, firmly up near session highs. Really interesting. We saw similar price action yesterday where you had a lot of big strength that then sort of deteriorated into the close. And today it feels a similar tone of being a little bit whipsawed. We were higher by more than 1%. Then we lost those 1% gains, and now we're higher by about 2% or so. Yesterday, we do know that we ended the 12 straight day streak of gains of more than 1% in any direction. So today, given that we're up more than 2%, that would be breaking that streak here again today. So you are seeing some of that, as well as dollar strength as well, that's continuing to climb. And crude is up more than 3.5% on a 24 handle. All, of course, on news that we expect Saudi Arabia and Russia try to get together to talk to figure out how to cut back some of that supply. Flipping up the board, David, I wanted to take a look at the residential market, in particular some of the REITs that we have been looking at. Ellington Residential Mortgage REIT is one in particular that I'm looking at. It is up now 50% or so. It's having its biggest intraday gain ever. It did come out and provide some updates on its portfolio and its business operations, which is giving some investors a relief here as well. They did come out and say they've met all their margin calls, they've lowered their leverage position, and maintained what they believe is a strong liquidity position. So there's been a lot of focus here, David, on the REITs, on the mortgage, on the commercial mortgage, and the residential market, how this would all fare. And for now, at least today, people are a little bit less concerned about the health of the mortgage market. David?
So Taylor, I always like good news, so I don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth. But to what extent is some of the lift we're seeing in equities really just short covering? Is it technical rather than fundamental?
I've heard a lot of that, David. There's been a lot of concern, and this is the hottest debate, if Twitter is a gauge of how fired up people are about this, of if this is the beginning of a new bull market. We do know that the S&P 500 today, it's up about 20% from the lows that we had on March 23rd. That would be at a 26 handle or so. We're at a 2,700 on the S&P 500. So if we would close at today's levels where we are right now, that would mean that we're up more than 20% from the bottom. Though, as you mentioned, a lot of people have been very quick to say, is this a real fundamental recovery, given we know that a lot of the bad news is still yet to come. We're waiting for Fed meeting minutes today. We know that the GDP data that will come out for the second quarter is likely going to be horrendous. But frankly, then a lot of strategists that I've been speaking to saying by the time you wait for that data, all the easy gains are going to have been made already. And so again, if you think that the market bottoms out when the health curve peaks, that could be one theory. A lot of other people, though, saying by then it's too late. You've already lost some of the big, easy wins here in the market.
Taylor, there's also that issue out there about more stimulus or spending. It's really not stimulus, spending coming down the pike. Apparently, they seem to be close to agreement on $250 billion, although Democrats want more than that. Is that part of what is really giving some support to equities, we think, today?
Yeah, so we were hearing some plans earlier today that you did have a large stimulus plan still under debate. We're calling it maybe stimulus 3.5 or stimulus 4. On that news, you also had gold prices rise in addition to that. You do hear, though, more policymakers, they're looking at what could be a $500 billion stimulus package this week. That's what the Trump administration is seeking. We do know that within Europe, the European Union, they failed to agree on a strategy on how to mitigate some of the economic crisis. So again, there are perhaps some more hopes and fears on this stimulus package. David, you and I have talked a lot about how the Small Business Association has been under a lot of strain. So small businesses have been urged to perhaps go to their local community banks. We know that a lot of those loans and a lot of those cash payments haven't even been paid out yet, given all of the red tape in the system. And so perhaps this new stimulus measure could be a way to perhaps just, again, get that money out the door, because a lot of these companies needed this weeks ago.
And Taylor, yesterday one of the things we saw was a lift for some of the stocks that would hit the hardest, things like cruise lines and airlines and things like that. Are we seeing any of that today? How are they doing?
100%, David. And I'm so glad that you brought that up. So yesterday and really all week, given that today's Wednesday, so it's been about 3 trading sessions, the stocks that had been the worst performers in this market route had been some of the best performers. Retail, you mentioned Carnival Cruise Lines. On the retail side of things as well, I was looking at Nordstrom's earlier today. They are up now almost 8% or so. These are companies where you think luxury is getting hit the hardest. Why would a company that's seen, fewer people come into the stores be outperforming? Well, they're tempting some junk bond yield investors with a 10% yield on a new debt issuance. So you're seeing perhaps maybe people in the credit markets are finally coming out and saying, hey, we used to never be able to dream of these 10% yields. So they're finally getting that. So that in particular is what is moving companies like Nordstrom's today. Luxury is getting hit harder, but Kohl's as well. Some of the discount retailers also some of the best performers today after, frankly, they were hit the hardest earlier in the market route. David.
Okay, thank you so very much to Taylor Ricks for that report on the markets. I want to turn now to the situation here in New York, and particularly with the hospital system. Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York has said that the hospitals really are redlining. They are at or even above capacity. And we welcome now Dr. Steve Corwin. He heads up New York-Presbyterian Hospital. It actually has 10 hospitals and about 200 clinics in the area. It is consistently ranked the best of the New York hospitals, and he welcomes us now. We welcome him now. He is the CEO and president of New York-Presbyterian. So, Dr. Corwin, thank you so much for joining us. You said at one point that you thought maybe the apex here in New York might be, April the 15th, which would be 1 week from today. Is that still your best estimate?
Dave, thanks for having me on, David. We are starting to see a little bit of flattening. So our best estimate is still right around that time. But hopefully I'm wrong, and that we see by Saturday a real trend in flattening. That would be certainly the first piece of welcome news in a while. So I'm hopeful.
And Dr. Corwin, how are the hospitals holding up? How is your hospital holding up? When we hear things from the governor like it's redlining, can you sustain the present level of activity for very long?
I have to tell you that our staff has just been remarkable. We've redeployed 2,000 physicians, 1,000 nurses, 500 general workers. We've gotten 2,000 people to volunteer. We have pediatric nurses delivering ICU care. We have our chief of dermatology functioning in the emergency room. We have our chief of cardiothoracic surgery functioning as an ICU doc. People are just going to extraordinary lengths. It's really remarkable. How sustainable is it over the long haul? It's not, but we think we can pull through this crisis and that we're not going to break.
Well, that's very encouraging news. When you talk, Dr. Corwin, about redeploying people, I think you're talking within New York Presbyterian. We also hear from Governor Cuomo a lot about redeploying physicians and nurses and other healthcare professionals among different hospitals as they reassign. Is that working well? Are you giving people to other people? Or are they giving them to you?
I'll give you a perfect example. One of our affiliated institutions, Hospital for Special Surgery, they stopped all their elective surgery. They've assigned a lot of their nurses and physicians to us, so that's an example of volunteerism. We've had people from around the country volunteer. We were on the phone yesterday with Mark Larrett from University of California, San Francisco. He's putting a team together for us. So the response around the country, the American spirit, has really been remarkable and very heartwarming for me.
And do you have a sense of how it's going in New Jersey, for example, our adjacent state here? They seem to be really still on their way up. Are they asking for help as well?
David, I don't know the specifics in New Jersey. I know that Governor Murphy said yesterday that they were on the way up. What I hope is that no state goes through what New York City and its surrounding counties are going through now. And I would just urge everybody to recognize that these social isolation and stay-at-home orders have been effective. I know in California they've seen much less in the way of this than us here in New York City, and I think part of that may have been an earlier application of the stay-at-home that Governor Newsom did, and I'm hoping other states follow suit on that.
So, Steve, that really leads us naturally to the next question. And we want to be careful of this question because we don't want to declare victory too soon and go back to a bad old situation. But we are starting to talk about now a plan at some point in the right situation to start reopening some of the economy. How do we develop that plan? How do we make sure that we don't revert at the same time as we have to go forward?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I think that the worst thing we could do would be to start prematurely and then lose the confidence of the American people and have to go back to where we are. And believe me, I recognize the millions of jobs, the recession that we most assuredly will enter, whole industries being stopped, the economy basically being stopped as a whole. I think that my expectation around this is that, on or around in the June or July timeframe, we're probably going to do some of that. The way that I would look at it from the personal situation in New York City is when I start seeing the decline and the return more towards normality, we're going to be in sort of phase two. Phase one being the upswing. Phase two being we're still living with the virus, but it is more controllable than what it was. And then phase three, probably, third, fourth quarter, we're talking about can we get back to a more normal situation. I would say that what Dr. Fauci said really is ultimately where we have to be, which is a vaccine and treatment, because I think the virus is going to be with us for a while. I hope we don't have a recurrence or a recrudescence of a real spike in October. And you've seen that if you release these things too early, you get another spike and you're back to square one.
As we talk to experts about the possibility of reopening, the thing we hear again and again and again is testing. We have to know whether we really are controlling it sufficiently. Where are we in testing? It appears we are not to the level we need yet of broad testing across the population to really come back safely.
I don't think we certainly have enough testing. In my hospital system, we have enough testing to test everybody that needs to be tested. But we're not at mass population screening. That's with the PCR test. That's one type of testing. And the second type of testing that everyone's working on is the serologic testing or the antibody testing. Were you infected with it, and does that confer immunity on you? You're still looking at 90% of the population that probably has not been affected by it. So the question starts to become, do you get some herd immunity? Do we have evidence of that? Are we sure that if you've been infected and you have the antibodies, that you're not going to get reinfected with it? These are still scientific questions to be determined. But I think, to your question, we need more testing, the PCR testing. Do you have the virus or don't you have the virus? And we're going to need to apply the serologic testing to determine what percentage of the population actually was infected by it, and are we starting to develop herd immunity as a country?
Okay, Doctor, thank you so very much for your time today. I know you are an awfully busy man, as your colleagues are. That's Dr. Steve Corwin. He is President and CEO of York-Presbyterian. And coming up here, we're going to talk about remote. Thank you, Steve. Really appreciate you being here. We're going to talk about remote sensing when it comes to COVID patients, maybe from home even, with the CEO of Masimo. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. One of the things that we need to do is give as much space as possible in the hospitals, maybe have COVID-19 patients when they're well enough to be monitored from home. Well, Masimo is a med tech company that's come up with a possible solution to that problem, and we welcome now the CEO of Masimo. He is Joe Kiani. So thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Kiani. Explain to me what your device is and how it works.
Our device is pulse oximeter technology that works even when there's patient movement and low perfusion. And we have made it into a wearable device that attaches to the wrist like a watch, and the sensor goes to the digit, and it can accurately measure continuously for 4 days at a time the oxygen saturation, pulse rate, respiration rate, perfusion, and PVI. And that information through Bluetooth is sent to your smartphone or smart tablet, and then from the smartphone or smart tablet through the cloud, it can be sent over to a central monitor, maybe at a hospital or even service that we provide, to continuously monitor the patients, both for COVID-19 and other issues that relate to respiratory problems.
And give us a sense of how much it's deployed right now. How much is that device being used for COVID-19 patients, either in the hospital or at home?
Well, Masimo's been around for 31 years. I founded the company, and we are the leading pulse oximeter company in the world. Over 200 million patients are monitored with our technology every year. 9 out of the 10 top hospitals in U.S. News primarily use our technology. And we have seen an amazing surge of demand for our products in the traditional settings in hospitals. And then also they're using this device in a couple of different ways. In hospitals to shield the patient from the care providers as much as possible. As you know, every time a care provider has to go to their room to watch the patient or watch the monitor, they require PPE, and they're also putting themselves at risk. So some hospitals are using this tetherless, wireless pulse oximeter technology to put the patient in the room and have the monitoring done outside the room. In addition, we've started a pilot program at University Hospital with Dr. Peter Pronovost and his colleagues, and at St. Luke's with Dr. Carmona. And what they're doing, they're sending patients that meet certain criteria for COVID-19 and other respiratory conditions to home and monitoring them remotely. And if they get to a situation, let's say their oxygen is 93% or lower for more than 5 minutes, these patients then are brought in. And right now we're wrapping up that pilot. Hopefully with the successful completion of that pilot, which 2 other hospitals are now taking part in, we're going to do a full market release of this product we call Masimo Safety Net, hopefully this weekend.
So give us a sense about your basic product. It sounds like it should be a lot of demand. Are you having any trouble keeping up with that demand? I mean, what are sales like right now?
Well, we actually had pre-announced our numbers because it was so much more than we had projected, and we just did that April 1st because we knew our suppliers knew what's happening, some of our people in manufacturing, our customers knew what was happening, and we're afraid the general public didn't know, so we did do that, and the demand has been tremendous, and it has not stopped. And we're holding up. We're keeping up with it. Fortunately, we began worrying about this COVID-19 potentially becoming a problem for us to manufacture. So we began modularizing our manufacturing, setting up other sites. We now have 3 sites that are manufacturing our sensors. We have multiple sites manufacturing our instruments. And so far, thank God, we don't have any problems in any of our factories. So we are able to keep up. And we're also building up inventory so that if we do have any hiccups, we can go through the inventory while we try to bring up another manufacturing site up.
So Joe, finally, give us a benefit of your expertise in the medical technology area. Go beyond a little bit your device at the moment. Obviously, we need more testing. We need a variety of various kinds of testing if we're going to bring the country and the economy back. What advice do you have to people in authority about how we can really ramp up effective testing so that we can start to get back to something that looks a little bit more normal?
Well, I think you said it. I think, first of all, there's only 2 ways out of this. Either a vaccine or we test 100% of our population, and those who have COVID-19, we separate them from the rest of the population until they are better so that we can be done with this once and for all. And I think to ramp up testing, I think the government needs to do what they've done with the ventilators to get other parties to help those that are creating those tests to increase the volume because you've got to basically test about 400 million people within 24 hours, and you've got to then isolate them because when you test someone and you send them back to the environment, they may come across someone who has got COVID-19, and now they'll get it, and so your test of negative COVID-19 becomes useless. So you really have to just massively do it or inoculate patients with vaccines. Otherwise, this is going to keep going on.
Joe, it's far too early to really decide or discern how this is going to change our lives for good. But in the medtech area, is this going to fundamentally transform medical technology and that business?
I believe so, in a few ways. I believe the COVID-19 has probably accelerated remote monitoring and telehealth by decades because now even elderly people, 65, 70, 80-year-olds have to learn how to use their phones to be in contact with their caregivers. And we are seeing cities deploy this Masimo safety net like Boston to monitor elderly people just in case they get in trouble so they can get to them rapidly. And I think the other is telehealth's all been about cardiac. Well, telehealth is now turned into all about respiratory. The coronavirus has made it into a respiratory issue, and I think that focus will remain and will help our people take better care of themselves if they have COPD, asthma, and other issues.
Joe, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to jump in there. We've just run out of time. That's Joe Kiani. He is the CEO of Masimo. And the programming note at 7:30 tonight, we're going to have a special called Downturn Damage Control. These are a collection of CEO interviews that we've done about how they're coping with the crisis. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Bloomberg Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, it is now all but certain that former Vice President Joe Biden will be the Democratic nominee for president in November. Senator Bernie Sanders dropped out of the race today after a string of defeats that left him with virtually no path to the nomination. Sanders' decision to step aside is a marked change from 2016 when he took the primary battle against Hillary Clinton until June, just as Clinton did with Barack Obama in 2008. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is said to be improving. He's still hospitalized in intensive care as he battles the coronavirus. But the UK Treasury Chief says Johnson has been sitting up in bed and engaging with the clinical team. Meantime, the UK reported 938 more virus-related deaths today, the deadliest day so far. More than 7,000 people in the UK have died since the beginning of the crisis. And here in the United States, Dr. Anthony Fauci says the start of the turnaround against the coronavirus could come after this week. The infectious diseases chief told Fox News now is not the time to pull back from efforts such as social distancing. Dr. Fauci also said the Trump administration is discussing how to reopen the economy, but he says that doesn't mean it will happen right now. New York City transit workers are being hit hard by the coronavirus. The Metropolitan Transit Authority says at least 41 workers have died and more than 6,000 are infected or are in self-quarantine. 3 weeks ago, only 23 transit workers had contracted the disease. The New York Times says MTA workers have accused the agency of not responding quickly enough to the crisis or to requests for personal protective equipment. Subway ridership is down more than 90%. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, European finance ministers met for over 16 hours remotely yesterday and failed to come up with agreement on a fiscal package to help out the European economy. Joining us now is Stephanie Flanders. She is Senior Executive Editor for Bloomberg Economics and also Wall Street Week contributor. So welcome, Stephanie. Good to have you here. Start off with, how big a hole are they trying to fill?
Well, it's an interesting situation, David, because, of course, there's a massive hole in the European economy at the moment, and governments are doing their bit, trying to come up with ways to protect the economy as they go into these different forms of lockdown. But the immediate issue is not what we had in the Eurozone crisis, where governments can't borrow and they need help to borrow to support their economies. They have been able to borrow, and in part they have been able to do that quite easily because the European Central Bank has been standing behind saying it'll do whatever it takes. So it's interesting in a way because the conversations of the European finance ministers, in a sense, are a sideshow. It's like the European finance ministers wanting to get in on the act and involve themselves in the rescuing of the Eurozone economy. But there are still some pretty fundamental issues at stake, and there are some things they could do that would certainly help countries through this.
So, Stephanie, you raise a really interesting prospect here. If, in fact, the individual countries can borrow, and in part they can still do that because the ECB is backing them up by buying bonds, then why do they need an overall plan? Why can't they leave it up to the 27 countries to figure it out for themselves, as it were?
Well, in one sense, there's a political issue here that, you're the Eurozone, you're supposed to be in this together, and if there's this common threat, which you're all facing, and it's an enormous threat to their economies right now, you should be able to show that, working together, you can do more than working separately. So I think they would politically like to show that they're contributing to this effort. There is a proposal, for example, by the European Commission, so that would be for all of the European Union countries, to have a €100 billion loan scheme to help labour markets in different countries. They think that they can help the countries that don't have as greater capacity to borrow because they've already got high debt, like Italy. They think they probably can help. But I would say it to some extent is a political issue. And I think it's also about what kind of Eurozone you want going forward. Do you want the kind of Eurozone that has common funds, common support for countries? And of course, that's been a debate right from the beginning.
Well, and Stephanie, I wonder whether it's different in Europe than the United States because your social net there is so much stronger in many ways in the United States. I mean, you actually have unemployment support, you have health care, a lot of countries have universal health care. Maybe the pressures are somewhat different from what we face in the United States with millions upon millions of people being put out of work.
Well, it is an observation that people have made that maybe some of the features of the European economy that have been criticized all these years when they've been said to be sclerotic because they have inflexible labor markets. It's hard to lay people off. And they have these really big welfare states that take up a lot of the economy. In this particular instance, where you want the government actually to be stepping in to be that insurance policy for everyone who's just been seen their business disappear, there are some advantages to having those sclerotic systems. It's harder for companies to lay people off so that more people might stay in work through this crisis. And it's also, if they do lose their jobs, of course, there's more of a safety net to catch them. But I don't think governments are being complacent about that. I mean, they still know that they need to come up with some ideas here that they haven't had to do before. Lots of countries have now done, for example, what the UK suggested, which is the guarantee to pay a certain chunk of salaries for companies to stop people being laid off. And I think that could end up being very expensive, but could play a big role in just making sure there is still that economy there once you decide to switch it back on.
So, Stephanie, one of the things that people over in the United States like to follow is the supposed debate, even contest between Germany, the northern countries on one hand, and the southern countries such as Italy on the other about a coronavirus bond, a euro bond overall. Is that overblown, or is that a very big division that could interfere with really addressing the problems in the economy there?
Yeah, and actually in this case, and one of the reasons why it has been so hard for the European finance ministers to agree this week is because there's quite a big divide, particularly actually the Netherlands, which tends to be, if you like, more German than the Germans in its approach to this, don't want the Eurozone to be a way for what they consider to be overspending, feckless countries to get away with more irresponsible behavior, kind of running up a tab for other countries that are more responsible, like the Netherlands or Germany. And that has always been an issue. How much are we going to pool our sovereignty when it comes to borrowing money and taking responsibility for that when we're part of the Eurozone? Italy, the Italian government, has been arguing to have that kind of Eurozone debt, a form of corona bond potentially, issued in this instance to give them more capacity to spend on this common threat to give the Eurozone more capacity to spend that Italy wouldn't have on its own. But the Netherlands and indeed to some extent Germany are saying, hang on, we still haven't seen you reduce your debt level. We still think you're pretty risky. We don't particularly want to borrow along with you. So that is a continued debate. It's been right at the heart of the Eurozone, never really resolved. But we are perhaps inching a little bit more in that direction with this crisis because it is such a common threat.
Okay, Stephanie, thank you so very much for your time today. That's Stephanie Flanders of Bloomberg, also a Wall Street Week contributor. And by the way, Wall Street Week will return to the air this Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time and then air throughout the weekend. In the meantime, coming up here next, we're going to have Jack Lew, former Secretary of the Treasury, telling us what we need to do for our economy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We all know the U.S. economy is headed for some very rough times ahead, and the federal government is really trying to do what it can to cushion that blow. We welcome now somebody who really knows the U.S. economy backwards and forwards. Among other things, he served as U.S. Treasury Secretary under President Barack Obama. He's now a visiting professor at Columbia, and he is Jack Lew. Welcome. It's great to have you here, sir. Thank you for joining us. First of all, give us your sense of where the economy is headed to. We know it's going to be a very ugly second quarter. Can we have any hopes of having something of a rebound in the second half?
Well, good to be with you, David. And I think it's quite clear that the economy is taking a very serious hit from this health crisis. And I think one of the things we know is that the economic impact will linger even after we turn the corner on the health crisis. It's going to take a while at best to turn the lights back on, and the government response really needs to be geared at maximizing the chance that we can restart in a smooth way. And that means making sure that people and businesses have what they need during the health crisis, but frankly, making sure that the assistance doesn't stop the minute we go out. A business is going to need money to pay its payroll. People aren't all going to go back to work. I think that, when you look at extending the benefits for businesses, it's very important to put more money in during the health crisis. It's also already time to start thinking about making sure that when they reopen, they still have the cash flow to support it. For state and local governments, they're going to lose revenue going into next year and even the year beyond. And the hole is far deeper than was filled the last time around. They need more stabilization money, and they need more matching money in Medicaid, more FMAP. Individuals are going to need some more assistance, and frankly, we're going to have to do a better job getting automatic payments to people who were left out the first time. People who are on SSI, people who don't file taxes, the legal children, American citizen children of non-citizens. A lot of people were left out. We need to close those gaps. And we need to increase food stamp benefits because that's going to make it possible for people to put food on the table. On top of that, we really need to worry about the rising problem of homelessness. People at the worst possible time are going to have no place to live, and there needs to be emergency assistance. On the business side, it's going to take a lot more money. It's also going to require that we find more ways to get flexibility into the program so that we lend to businesses that have not traditionally borrowed money from banks. That's very hard to do if you hold the bank to standards that apply in normal times, but these are not normal times.
Jack, talk to us about the efforts to really support small business right now. We have this $350 billion. There are reports that it's hard for some banks to loan the money because of some anti-money laundering provisions, some restrictions. Does it make sense to ease those up some? Is that a legitimate reason some banks are saying we can't deal with small businesses if we don't know them? It's the know your customer rule.
So there have been multiple levels at which the normal rules have to be modified or suspended. So with a federal guarantee, there's no credit risk to the banks, but they still have underwriting risk potentially, and they still have exposure on things like money laundering enforcement. On the underwriting side, if there's any kind of a false statement, that burden has to fall on the business that makes the false statement, and it can't be that the bank is facing after-the-fact oversight on that. If we're asking them to rely on certifications, we are not giving them the time to look behind the certifications that the businesses make. On the AML side, I think that they need to be creative and find a solution. Every business that has a bank account has gone through some kind of know your customer process. We need to make sure that any business that has a banking account can use the process they went through, whether it's at the bank they're borrowing from or not, to satisfy those KYC requirements. What we can't afford is we can't afford at the end of this to have failed to loan money to the smallest and most vulnerable businesses, the Main Street businesses, that don't have a history of bank credit. So when the major banks and even the community banks say we're only going to lend to a business that we've already lent to, that rules out the businesses that are most likely to fail. And I believe deeply in enforcing things like anti-money laundering rules, so I'm not somebody who's ever been casual on this. I think we have to be creative to find a way to get through that hurdle.
Jack, there's talk about whether we need to top this up, so to speak, the small business, maybe another $250 billion. Is it time to do that right now and keep the money going out the door, or should we wait and see how it's proceeding, whether it's having an effect in the economy?
Well, I have to say that the whole need for response here is immediate in the sense that we shut the economy down. We need to make sure that these businesses are there when we open it back up. And if we take too much time to try to get things perfect, which is always my preference, I'd love to be able to say every I was dotted, every T was crossed. We will look back and regret it because there'll be so many business failures that the length of the recovery is extended, the depth of the recession is deepened, and the number of people unemployed lingers at a very high level. Half of American workers are working in small businesses, and we need them to be able to go back to work when the health conditions permit it. So I think time is of the essence. I thought that the funds that were put in this third bill were very helpful, but I didn't think it was adequate at the time when you just look at the number of businesses that are going to need help. So I'm not surprised that they're looking at providing some more assistance. What I'm trying to add into the thinking process and the comments I'm making is when the green light comes to open up, there has to be cash flow to reopen. So there's going to be a need to continue some of this assistance a little longer than the health crisis, just like there's going to be a need to help people who are on unemployment with extended benefits and food stamps, SNAP, and other kinds of assistance, as long as the economy is lagging behind because of the health crisis.
Jack, whatever we do, whatever more stimulus and spending there's done, the government's going to have to borrow an awful lot of money. We already have $2 trillion in the last spending package. That means a lot of issuance from the U.S. Treasury. Might that change the way issuance is done? For example, should we reconsider something like an ultra-long bond? Some people have even suggested maybe a war bond. As President Trump has said, we're at war with this virus. That's been used in prior wars. Should we be thinking about different sorts of issuance coming out of the U.S. Treasury?
I think we need to be open to be using the whole yield curve to finance this huge increase in debt in the most efficient way possible. I've never been persuaded that the 50-year bond is likely to have the kind of deep market that could be relied on. This feels like a dangerous time to run an experiment on a major scale with a new concept. We have very deep, very well-developed markets we can go long and short. And I think the demand for the U.S. debt will remain strong in the global economy that we're in as long as it is clear that we're responding to this crisis and that we have the resilience to bounce back. I think that the place where I am worried about the financial shortfall being crushing and without federal assistance there will be terrible consequences is at the state and local level. They operate, many of them, with balanced budget requirements. If they can't fill the holes in their budget because of sales tax revenue being off, because of gasoline tax revenues being off, and because of income taxes being off and delayed, they're going to start cutting back on vital services, and they're going to be canceling things like road programs, and that will have macroeconomic consequences. Overall, I've spent most of my career worrying, and I continue to worry about the long-term sustainability of our deficit and our debt. I do not believe that in this moment, if we are penny wise and pound foolish, it will be a good thing. We're going to need to spend what it takes to come out of this healthy, where the economic costs in the long run will be greater and the debt and deficit will be greater. As far as financing it goes, we need, I think, to be careful, as Treasury typically is, in going into markets to make sure that we maintain the depth and liquidity for what is an extraordinarily large increase in federal borrowing.
Jack, thank you so very much. That is Jack Lew, former Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, has made it official. He is now suspending, as he says, his campaign for president, which leaves the former Vice President Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee. So to go over all this with us, we welcome now Jeannie Zaino. She is our political contributor at Bloomberg and, of course, is also a political science professor at Iona College. So welcome, Jeannie. Did this surprise you?
I don't think it's a big surprise that we sort of had noticed that this was coming down the pike. For one thing, Joe Biden, out of courtesy to Bernie Sanders, had told him a few days ago in the last several days that he was beginning his vice presidential search. Of course, Bernie Sanders is well behind in the delegate count, almost, I think, about 300, depending on who's counting. And then, of course, yesterday we had the Wisconsin primary. And while we're not going to get results until Monday, the polling out there looked like Wisconsin, a state that Bernie Sanders won in 2016, Joe Biden was going to take, and not just take, but maybe by double digits. So that, I think, was another sign that this last state that Bernie Sanders had really been prepared for and organized in, it was not going to go his way. So I think he really saw the writing on the wall. He told his staff earlier today, and then his supporters just, right before noon Eastern time, that he was going to be dropping out. But I think importantly, he's going to try to still have a voice on the platform, which I think his supporters really were hungry to hear.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. I mean, Bernie Sanders consistently has pursued a particular set of policies, and he wants to pull the party in a certain direction. Does he have any pull left?
He does. I mean, he's got, depending on how you count, he's got about 900 delegates, give or take. He said he is going to still keep those delegates, amass whatever he can going forward, and he's going to use that to exert an influence on the Democratic platform. So while I think what he's trying to do is both bow out gracefully and acknowledge the writing on the wall, but also show his supporters in this movement that he's led that has really changed the trajectory of the Democratic Party, that he's going to try to influence this party and this platform going forward. And I think, in fairness to Bernie Sanders, we have to acknowledge he's already had an enormous impact on the Democratic Party. It is much more progressive than it was when he started. There was a time 5 years ago when the idea of Medicare for all was sort of something that no mainstream Democrat would talk about. This time around, you had many, members of the party, many people running for president talking about it. So he's had a huge influence, and I think his supporters want to know that that influence is going to continue. And the platform of the Democratic Party is important, and I think if the convention goes forward, he'd also try to have a prominent speaking role there. So I think strategically he's going to still have a key role in both the party and the convention. And also, of course, he seems to have a much better relationship with Joe Biden than he did with Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. And so I think that that's also playing a role here.
Yeah, fascinating. That Wisconsin primary was really something. I hope it's not a harbinger of things to come, because it seemed to be pretty messy. They had to go to the Supreme Court to decide whether they were going to hold or not. Thank you so much to Jeannie Zaino. She's on Iona College and our very valued Bloomberg contributor here. Coming up, we're going to have a second hour Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, and we will continue to talk about that Wisconsin primary. We'll be joined by the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio.